Well, hello everybody, and thank you for those who are joining me. I am Dr. Annette Feravich, and I am with Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit. Today, I am giving you a first look at our new series on depression and behavior. And the reason why that I wanted to look at both of those things, not just depression and what depression is, but really, because I am a social psychologist, I think about all of these phenomenon, and in particular, so many changes in our social relationships, so many changes in the way that we feel about ourselves, about one another, so many changes in our daily lives. And because of these changes, we know that individuals are really experiencing much greater levels of anxiety and much greater levels of depression. And so I thought that this would be really a timely topic. But again, I'm a social psychologist, and so I look for answers in our behavior. And that's what I want to encourage you to do in this series. So this is our new series again on depression and behavior. And for today, our very first topic is, what is depression? So I'll be talking a little bit more about what I have prepared for this entire series. In fact, we will be talking about how depression affects our brain. And we're going to be talking about how it affects our body and our neurotransmitters and our stress levels. We're going to be talking about reactions that it has to the body and how that might also instigate certain behaviors that we engage in. We're going to be talking about antidepressants and the way that antidepressants affect our brain. And then we're going to also be talking about what gratitude has to do with our mood levels and our levels of depression. Also, I encourage you to go to my website, www.healthymindbodyspirit.net. What you can find in my website, first of all, is why I am able to talk about these things. Why am I qualified to talk about depression and even talk about things like antidepressants and behavior relative to depression? So go to my website and you can find out those things. You can also find out other interesting facts about nutrition. You can find out some things about how spirituality really helps us get through so many of these difficult times. So as we go through this, we're going to highlight many of those things. And thank you for joining me again. Okay. The first thing that I wanted to talk to you about was some of the statistics that we see relative to depression. And some of the things that are really surprising that I think that you'll probably find interesting is that these statistics, of course, have changed dramatically with COVID-19. So here I've got some of the statistics that are from 2017, 2018, and then also some statistics that are since COVID as well. Many of these statistics are from the State of Mental Health in America. What I want you to know here is that these statistics are evidence-based statistics. There's a lot of people who are saying trust the science. And what I like to teach not only my students, but also you out there in this YouTube land, is that I want to teach you how to look at the science. We are not supposed to just assume that scientists are giving us answers to some of the questions that we might have. They give us information, but do we have questions beyond the information that they give us, and can they answer those questions? So in much of what we're talking about, what I want you to do is start thinking more and more in a critical way about the science that supports your beliefs. The way that we end up changing ourselves is because we change our beliefs. And after I'm done with 7 weeks of this series, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit more about the therapy associated with our ability to change our beliefs. Okay, but stay tuned. Again, this is episode number 1, and we are talking about what is depression. All right, okay. So here we can see in 2017 and 2018, adults experience some mental illness. over 19% of adults, almost 20% of adults experience some form of mental illness. And this was approximately 1.5 million more people than the previous time that they picked those data statistics up. And that's in 2017 and 2018. So remember that this is before COVID. Almost 10% of youth have severe major depression, and approximately 12.4% if you are a person of color. So what we are finding out from depression statistics is that many people are suffering. Many more people are suffering than have been in the past. And also what we're finding out is that our youth are the ones that seem to be suffering the most. And we call those Gen Z. So our Gen Z group is the one that seems to be suffering the most. We're going to be talking more about that. So 60% of youth did not get mental health services. So even though they needed them, and some of them, 10% with severe major depression, 60% of them did not get mental health services. 27.3% of the severely depressed individuals that did get treatment, that treatment was still inconsistent. And again, this is in 2017 and 2018. What we see now also is that we have increasing numbers of individuals who are uninsured, and so this is the largest increase that we've seen since the Affordable Health Care Act. So you can see changes in our insured individuals due to changes in legislation. And then we also see that in 2020, anxiety increased 62%. You can also see there, the big stat that I have there in bold, 70% said one of the top 3 things that contributed to their depression was loneliness and isolation. Okay, one of the reasons that I have the anxiety statistic there is because anxiety has been demonstrated to be a precursor to depression. Now, this may seem like it's very logical to you, but again, a lot of times very scientific sounding things sound logical, and we find them to actually not be true. So we say birds of a feather flock together, right? But opposites attract. Well, which one is it, right? What do the statistics say? And so, even though some things make sense, it's very interesting when we find out that the evidence supports that. So we did find out that the evidence does support that anxiety is a precursor to depression. Cohen, C-O-H-E-N, with Fredrickson, has been doing research on stress and health for a number of years and demonstrated a causal relationship between anxiety and depression. And so this is important, and it's an important feature of understanding depression. And we're going to get into this a little bit more. But the reason why it's an important feature in understanding depression is because sometimes it's very difficult for us to control our depression. We have ruminating thoughts, and by the time that we've gotten to depression, we've changed our chemistry in our bodies. And so one of the reasons why we have been led to believe that depression has got a genetic basis is because it can change depression, or whatever emotion we feel over and over again, can change the chemistry in our body. And so we do see that chemistry, brain chemistry, hormones, and even part of our nervous system begins to react in habitual ways. And because of this habit, what ends up happening is that we see that there are changes within our body, and even changes in our DNA, because changes in our DNA occur when certain DNA get activated. Let me give you an example, okay? Let's say that we are musically inclined, okay? But we grew up on a desert island, and for some reason there was no musical instruments, and we never figured that out. So we were never exposed to music. Well, even if we were musically inclined, that gene would not get activated without an environmental component. This is critical to understanding any personality characteristic. Depression certainly is a personality characteristic. And so what we're finding is that environmental circumstances contribute to our genetic changes and our genetic activation. And even more so, what we find out is that can actually then affect the DNA of generations to come. And so what I'm saying is that behaviors are critically important if we want to understand even changes in our biological chemistry, in our biological systems. Okay. Here's another stat that I had for you that I wanted you to see here. Now, this stat was in 2017, and you can see that this is a statistic from the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization is showing us now worldwide statistic. Some of the statistics that I was just talking about just a minute ago were statistics that are exclusive to the United States. And here we can see statistics that compare to the world. And again, this is 2017, and so we see this shows us consistently females are more depressed than males are, and we can see that then across the world. We're going to take a look at this when we take a look at measures of depression to see whether or not this statistic is really a good or valid statistic, or if maybe we need to see something and look at some things differently. These are some of the statistics that I introduced at the very beginning here. So you can see 19% of adults experienced some kind of mental illness. This is an increase from the previous data set of 1.5 million, and you can see that we were looking at these before COVID. Here's where we see the statistic of 9.7% of youth are experiencing major depression, and if you're a person of color, it's 12.4%. We also see that 60% of youth have not gotten any mental health treatment, and even the 27% there that we were talking about that did get mental health treatment, it was not consistent. There we have the 10.8% of individuals who are uninsured, and there we've got suicidal ideation has also increased. All right, let's take a look at some other stats here as well. Actually, what I want to do is I want to ask you a question. Where do you think that the United States falls? So where do they rank with other countries in the world relative to depression? So let's say, do you think first of all, do you think that they are number one? Okay, so are they number one, highest across the world in depression? Or B, do you think that we are in the top 5 for depression? C, do you think that we are in the top 10? Okay, or D, do you think that we are in the top 25? Okay, so do you think that we are number 1 of all countries in depression? Do you think that we are in the top 5, B? Do you think that we are in the top 10, C? Or do you think that we are in the top 25 nations, D, in depression? So let's take a look at that then. And we see here that the number 1 country for depression. And again, why do we have depression and anxiety both there for us? Well, the reason why is because 62% of individuals who are depressed also are anxious. And again, like we said, anxiety is a precursor to depression. So interesting, we also have there in the third, actually in the fourth column there, we have got in countries ranked by alcohol and drug use. And so you can see, for example, United Kingdom, there first shows up and only shows up on the list of those ranking in the top 10 for alcohol and drug use, for as ranked as number 6, but not ranked anywhere else in this. We can see also, in fact, there are several countries that are not ranked on this list anyplace else, but are ranked under alcohol and drug use. And then you can see, where is the United States? Well, clearly the United States there is number 3 in all categories. So 3rd in depression, 3rd in anxiety, 3rd in alcohol and drug use, and so our overall ranking is 3rd. We are beat out by China. So China overall has the greatest alcohol and drug use. You can see that they are number 2 for depression and anxiety. Interestingly, they switch positions with India. India is number 1 for depression and anxiety, number 2 for alcohol and drug use, and ranks overall number 2. So China and India. And interesting also, when we think about the economic conditions of those countries and also the political conditions of those countries, because we know both politics and economics drastically impact our satisfaction with life scales. Satisfaction with life scales have to do with happiness. Okay. All right, so here are a few more stats. Now, what I wanted to do is take just a little bit closer look at this Gen Z. So if you're familiar with how we are labeling these generations, and what's been around the longest have been the label of baby boomers. Baby boomers are born from approximately World War II to 1964, after World War II, after the Great Depression, because what were they doing? They actually were celebrating more and having more babies, so the baby boomers. That ended in 1964. In 1965, we start with the Gen X generation. And after that generation comes the millennials. And after that generation comes the Gen Z. And you can look that up on the internet for the exact breakout of that. But here we're talking about Gen Z. And Gen Z, we've got starting with the young Gen Z, so that when they're talking about these statistics and they're talking about youth, they're talking about 13 to 17 of the Gen Z. And when they're talking about adult Gen Zs, they're talking about 18 to 23 for adult Gen Zs. But here you can see the dramatic difference in the way that some of the events of the world are impacting this younger generation. So it says nearly 1 in 5 adults, approximately 20%, which is what we saw before, say their mental health is worse than it was this time last year. And we see that the most significant individuals who are saying that are Gen Z, 34%, Gen X, 21%, the boomers, 12%, and then older adults are 8%. So we see that this young generation is really having a much more difficult time learning to cope. And coping mechanisms, remember, those have to do with behaviors. Some other stats that we have. Here we can also see that disruption to education for Gen Z adult college students. And so we see here 87% say that their education is a significant source of stress. 82% say that they have uncertainty about what the 2021 school year will bring, and 67% say that the pandemic makes planning for their future feel impossible. Now, these are very strong words that we see here. It's one thing to say, yes, I'm depressed, or yes, I'm stressed, or I'm even significantly more stressed than I used to be. That's one thing. But to say that I am so overwhelmed by the stress that I feel like it's nearly impossible to make plans, what that suggests is hopelessness. Now, there's going to be a lot of things that I'm going to repeat throughout these sessions, but there are some very important and critical messages that I hope that you're getting along the way. And this is one of the critical messages. What we know is that depression is an outcome of feelings of no control. When I feel I have no control, what I tend to be is pessimistic. Well, of course, that's what we see here in these statistics, right? What we see are individuals who are feeling pessimistic. So, pessimism is a result of feelings of no control. And what that leads to is feelings of helplessness. And when I feel helpless, what do? I give up is what I do. When I feel helpless, I give up. And when I give up because I'm feeling hopeless. And that's what we know leads to depression. Okay? So, what's the precursor of that feelings of no control? feelings of anxiety, feelings of frustration due to feelings of no control. Well, it's clear then how we can see that things like the pandemic that are completely out of our control, including all of the regulations that are going behind this as well, right, that are going on as well, are also feeling like they are out of our control, where we see all kinds of misinformation and or backlashes because of individuals feeling that they have no control. So there are behaviors that lend themselves to feeling I have more control. And that's what's important when we're talking about depression and behavior. What we want to talk about are those things that we can do, that I don't have to rely on what somebody else says. What we're doing here and what healthy mind, body, spirit is all about is about knowing your body better. Because you are the one who's going to know your body more than anyone else, right? So if you know your body more than anyone else, what I'm telling you to do now is to start getting in tune to your body. But that's really interesting as well. We need to get in tune to our body in the right way so that we're not being overwhelmed by stimuli, right? That's taking over our body or taking over our minds when we start focusing on it, okay? All right, so what we need is, throughout all of this, is a really good balance, because that's what our bodies need, is a good balance. And if our bodies need it, that means our minds need it as well, and so do our spirits need balance. So sometimes it feels like getting a hold of depression is hard work. And that's because sometimes it is, especially when what I'm saying that's needed are behavioral changes. So sometimes it feels like it's very hard work. But listen to this, and hopefully this will give you hope. We are made for that hard work. Our bodies are made to do that hard work. Why? Because what we're doing in that work is, well, if we're not hopeless, then what we're doing is we are becoming more hopeful is what we're doing. So we are doing work to become more hopeful. Well, guess what? Our minds and our spirits in particular are tuned into and strive for and seek with great vengeance those things that are meaningful and have purpose. So even though behaviors that take us out of depression are difficult, the very first thing we want to know is that it was behaviors that got us into that difficult problem in the first place. Okay? Usually what gets us into these predicaments or problems are the repeated behaviors. They could be bodily behaviors that we've done over and over again, but they can also be cognitive behaviors that we've done over and over again. And so what we find is that there are behaviors that get us into these routines that change our bodies and change our chemistry and change our thinking. And so I'm the advocate that says, therefore, it's behaviors that get us out of these problematic circumstances. And what that does then is naturally changes your brain instead of using chemicals to change your brain. I want you to think about where pharmaceuticals are produced. They're produced in a laboratory. How is it that you can understand human behavior in a laboratory, or even consider human behavior in your research, in your theories, in your methodology? How are you even including individuals? And so, if you want to take more control of this instead of having your outcomes decided where human beings are really individuated, they're de-individuated in a lab. You are not dealing with humanity in a lab. So I am here to give you some different ways to get out of this depression that is tied to key behaviors. Okay? So again, what I'm saying is yes, this can be difficult because we're changing behaviors. And sometimes it's the last thing that we want to do because that's hard. Right? Okay, let's continue. Okay, and here we take a look at one more stat on these Gen Z younger adult individuals and teen individuals. We see here the average reported stress level during the past month. And so for the average of all those other adults we were talking about, you can see that it was under, it was, well, what was it, 4.9 starting out in 2018. Gen Zs were significantly higher than the rest of the adults. Age 24 and older. But then we can see what's going on in 2019 and 2020, that this gap is increasing. So we have got a real crisis on our hands when we are talking about what we are doing to this younger generation and what kind of fears we're creating. A few more depression statistics that have to do with health, because when we're talking about this, and I know that this creates even more anxiety in young individuals because now they're looking at health outcomes. But hopefully this is also a motivation and an incentive to get this under control. All right, so we see here that individuals who are depressed have 4 times more the mortality rate. Mortality is death rate, and 5 times more disability rate. It's the 4th leading cause of disability because people can't work. They can't get out of bed when they're depressed. And it's the leading cause of disability for women. Look at the next stat. 88% of women experience depression after major trauma. So we see that statistics are showing more and more that women are suffering from depression more than men are. We're going to take a close look at this when we look at some of the differences in the measures that we take when we're taking a look at emotions that are related to depression. And so there are some faulty measures that are demonstrating women are more often susceptible to depression. Women are more often susceptible to depression when it is framed in terms of sadness, crying, staying in bed, or other internalized kinds of emotions. But when you're talking about external behaviors, such as anger, aggressiveness, even suicidal tendencies, being incarcerated, alcohol, drug use, those kinds of aggressive behaviors we see more often in men, and they are also tied to both emotions, right, such as anger, and they are also tied to depression. And what we see are differences in measures. And these are things you say, well, Dr. Feravich, I don't care about stupid measures. Maybe you do care about these measures because, once again, understanding how scientists and doctors and pushers of pharmaceuticals are measuring your depression and categorizing you. They do this in a similar way for all psychological categorizations of these kinds of mental diseases. If they're measuring most mental health diseases in the same way, we want to make sure these are good measures. And what I'm telling you right from the get-go is we've already made mistakes regarding our measures of depression, and this is the reason why we see these inequalities in depression between men and women, so gender differences. Okay, let's move on. So damage to the heart is comparable to smoking. This is one of the critical reasons why I believe that we need to be studying these psychological effects on the body more often than we are just watching the physiological or biological effects, which is what we have predominantly been doing even in psychology. We instead, I believe, need to focus on what stress is doing to the body, because those are psychological traumas that are affecting our health. Okay, so again, damage to the heart from depression is comparable to that of smoking. Okay, and then also doubles the impact of LDL, low density lipoproteins, and this is what affects our heart and causes clogged arteries and also causes heart disease. So this is our cholesterol, lipoproteins. Lipo is fat. So this is cholesterol that gets clogged in our arteries. And we can see there $74.4 billion in medical costs and loss in productivity due to depression alone. This is interesting statistic that I have here for you, and I'm going to just blow it up a little bit. Okay, and what we see there then are different symptoms. And we can see then that the percent of individuals, they can explain it both as depression and anxiety, so the numbers aren't going to add up to 100%. But the unexplained there is they are not suffering from depression or anxiety, and they still have a symptom of, for example, a headache. So 48% come in and say, I have a symptom of a headache and it's unexplained. But 53% of individuals who say they're depressed, or 44% who say that they're anxious, have headaches. Chest pain, 66% of individuals who are depressed and 66% of individuals who are anxious claim that they have chest pains. Individuals who are depressed or anxious come in for back pain. You can see around 50% of the time for depressed and 40% for anxiety. Joint pain, 58% are depressed, 48% are anxious. Shortness of breath, 64% claim that they are depressed, 64% and 44% anxious. And then stomach problems, 46% are also claim that they are depressed, along with 40% claiming that they are anxious. Now what I have here is a definition for depression. And so how is depression defined? You can see there what we've got is we've got three different ways or three different events that can lead to depression. So here you see, first of all, it can be life events. So there's a normal reaction to life events, and sometimes that could leave us feeling sad. That leads to minor depression. We also have individuals who are on medication, and they end up as a side effect of the medication is depression. And so due to illness or the medications that individuals are taking, illness also leads to depression as well. So these things have to do with our health. Also, there can be a biological basis where there ends up being neurochemical abnormalities. And so this, I have the two arrows there. Those two arrows indicate that we don't know, however, whether it is biology that causes neurochemical changes and depression, or whether it is events that cause neurochemical changes. These neurochemical abnormalities can have a biological basis to it, but it also can have an environmental basis that changes our biology. All right, and then also we see there that it can be a combination. So we may have minor depression from life events, but because our behavior is such that we ruminate about those life events, that might end up changing our chemistry then, and in changing our chemistry, it might also then require that we end up on some pharmaceuticals, or that our minor depression then changes our biology, right? So now we have a combination of events going on. Here I want to talk a little bit about symptoms that we have of depression. All right, and the first symptom there that we have is anhedonia. Anhedonia. And anhedonia is described as a loss of pleasure. And this loss of pleasure, what it does is it's affected by a neurotransmitter in our brain, so chemistry in our brain, called dopamine. So when we feel unmotivated, it typically is associated with the neurotransmitter dopamine. Now we're going to be talking about that a little bit more later on, and I just want to mention that. This neurotransmitter is important for motivation. Now, anhedonia is also described as melancholic depression, right? And melancholic depression, again, is where individuals are getting very little pleasure out of life. I'm quite certain many of you can describe yourselves as this way. You're unmotivated to do things because they just don't seem to give you pleasure. And so here you can see, this is a study because what I bring to you is evidence-based, by Treadway and Zald in 2013. And they asked the question, is depression due to a lack of pleasure or due to a lack of motivation? And they're asking this question because when science and scientists have observed or looked at and studied anhedonia, a lot of times what they're doing is they're just looking at this depressed effect, this lack of motivation. But what Treadway and Zalt did was that they discerned or took apart and measured separately pleasure from motivation. And it was a very clever study that they did. So what they did was they gave individuals a choice. Not individuals, these were individual mice, okay? So they gave mice or rats or whatever they were using in that study. They gave mice or rats. And what they did was they gave them food, and they gave them delicious food, and then they gave them non-delicious food. And they had that food in an easy place for them to be able to get to that food. So let's just take a look back here at this. And you can see here that in this rat's cages, that you can see that there's elevated space up here where this was harder to access, right? So you had to have much more motivation if I wanted to access something at this higher level, okay? And then we can see here, though, however, that if it's on the lower level, I don't need a whole lot of motivation in order to get whatever I need. So what they did was they made easy access for them to get either, like I said, delicious food or non-delicious food. But it's at the lower level, so it's easy access to the food, okay? And what did they find? They found that the mice ate the more delicious food. And so what this means is that when you are depressed, you do not have lower enjoyment. You take the same amount of pleasure in events as you used to. In this study, they were using food, right? And obviously, we have to replicate the studies to see whether or not this is true for other pleasurable things. But this was very clever to determine, yes, I still actually do get the same amount of pleasure out of those things that were pleasurable. Now, I might not feel like I get the same amount of pleasure, but with low effort, I was still willing to eat the more pleasurable food. So I must get pleasure out of it. Then what they did was they separated the food so that it took high effort for the mice to get the delicious food and low effort for the mice to get the non-delicious, undesirable food. And what ended up happening was that depressed rats, those rats that were low in this case, dopamine, were less likely to make the effort to go climb up the stairs to get the delicious food. So they ended up eating the undesirable food. Why? Not because it was less desirable, but because they were less motivated to get the food. So when we take a look at this chart here, this MDD is major depressive disorder. So we can see here the percent of high effort choices. In the control group, where they had rats that were not experiencing major depressive disorder, lower levels of dopamine, that they went for the high effort food. We can see here those rats that had major depressive order, they did not go for the high effort food. They were less likely to be motivated to get the food, even though it was clear that those mice still enjoyed that desirable food. Another part of this study that was also interesting was this, that these mice with major depressive disorder had lower levels of adrenaline. And so that actually may be what is key to getting individuals motivated. So there's dopamine manipulation, which helps with motivation, but in this case, it was adrenaline. Now, Again, here's another important tidbit of information relative to adrenaline. How do we get adrenaline going in our bodies, right? Epinephrine and norepinephrine, that's our adrenaline. Now, we don't want it going all the time because that also increases cortisol, our stress hormone. However, when we get it going under conditions that we choose, such as becoming more engaged in life, so doing things. So we can see why individuals certainly are unmotivated during this pandemic. We're not using our epinephrine and our norepinephrine. We are not getting our adrenaline going. And why not? Because we're not engaged. We're not going downhill skiing. We're not challenging ourselves to challenging conversations. Oh, we're fighting. We're certainly fighting and making chaos out of things, right? But we are not actually critically engaging in a social interaction that can be beneficial and edify individuals. What we need to do is challenge ourselves in just small ways initially so that we can get the dopamine going and we can get the adrenaline going. And those are the things that help motivate us, okay? All right, let's keep moving. Now, how is major depression diagnosed? What I have here is I have got what is called, this is the revised social readjustment rating scale is what it's called technically. But if you take a look at it, you can see what it's made up of. And what it's made up of are different life events that have occurred, and then it gives them certain number of points. So, of course, the more points that you have, the more critical your life experiences are, and the more likely you are to be impacted by those life experiences. The more coping skills you're going to need to get over these life experiences when those numbers are higher. On average, the average score is about 155. So you can kind of judge individuals, of course, are scoring 300 on this, and when you're scoring 300, you of course have a lot of events in your life that can easily cause stress. Now, the interesting thing about this is that individuals can take these events in many different ways. I have got quite a few of those high stressful events. One, because I just lost a spouse who is my domestic partner at the very least, the father of my children at the very most. And then also within the last so many years I was divorced, and also experienced a marriage. So even positive events can create great stress in our lives as well. But it still can depend a lot on how you take that and perception and the type of meaning and purpose that you're making out of those events. And if you've been following me, as you know, there were many blessings, even though that doesn't sound very good, there were many blessings in my husband's passing. And that has created some great meaning and some great purpose, at the very least in my life, as I'm going through this. So those scores can really be great, but those events can also impact people in different ways. So as you can see, it's a little messy as we get started trying to measure things like depression. Now, typically, when we are measuring depression, what we are using from a clinical perspective, so if you go see a therapist and the therapist is diagnosing depression, typically that therapist diagnoses depression through what's called the DSM, and now it's on version 5 of the DSM. DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And so basically what they have in there is they have got a list of mental disorders along with a list of symptoms as well. And this is then the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5 criteria for major depressive disorder. And one of the things about diagnosing these psychological mental disorders or diagnosing mental illness in general is that, again, the therapists, counselors, and psychotherapists and psychologists are typically using this DSM as criteria. And then psychiatrists, what they do is they take that criteria from this checklist that you see here, and then they end up prescribing medication. So does the individual have a depressed mood? And you can see the definitions there: loss of interest or pleasure, like we said, weight loss or gain, where we see that actually that is a very big contributing factor and a very big symptom that we see when we get back to the symptoms is weight changes, and then lack of sleep and lack of eating right. So there you see, again, insomnia or hypersomnia. So are you crawling in bed all the time? And you have it, again, experiencing it nearly every day. You have psychomotor agitation or retardation. This really is what this is an inability to move our bodies like we need to move our bodies. Because why? Because we're shaking, right? That can be it. Because we don't breathe the way that we are supposed to. Because we are so anxious, right? Fatigue, feeling worthless or excessive inappropriate guilt, decreased concentration, thoughts of death or suicide. And then you can see here, additional required criteria: symptoms cause clinically significant distress, episode not attributed to physiological effects such as substance use or medication. So there, what you see there is a checklist is what you see. And that's how we determine whether or not individuals have major depressive disorder, using a checklist. Now, how comfortable do you feel? That's the same thing that they ended up doing for my son when they were determining whether or not he had attention deficit disorder. They had a counselor come from the nearby public school to watch him for 15 minutes and determine that he had a neurological disorder, ADHD, which is a neurological disorder, and needed pharmaceuticals in order to correct that neurological disorder. I was also told that he would never get off of that medication, as well as there was no cure for ADHD. None of that really is scientifically sound at all. None of it. First of all, ADHD may be a neurological disorder, but there were no brain imaging techniques that were done when they first started diagnosing in the 80s that individuals had ADHD, and when they began to prescribe things like Ritalin for ADHD. There were no neurological tests that verified what was going on in the brain. And I've said this before, and likely no neurological tests that are equating ADHD with a specific neurological disorder, because those things are simply too difficult to understand and too difficult to find. So here is my concern, and this is what I'm trying to teach you. A lot of times we think because they say that ADHD is a neurological disorder and therefore medication is necessary in order to change the brain chemistry, they really are basing that more on theory. And as you can see, the DSM, there's not a lot other than theory behind it, right? So it feels like those are the things I should be measuring for depression. But when we take a look at the differences in the different depression inventories that we've seen, which we're going to take a look at right now, we can see that maybe the measures are not really as good as we had hoped that they would be. Yep. So here, what I'm now showing you is what's called the Beck Depression Inventory. This is an inventory that we use as psychologists to determine depression. So it's not the same as what your counselor uses as a measure, but it feels similar though. So here, I do not feel sad. I feel sad. I am sad all the time. I am so sad and unhappy that I can't stand it. I'm not particularly discouraged. I don't feel like a failure. I get satisfaction out of life. I feel particularly guilty most of the time. I expect to be punished. I am disgusted with myself. I blame myself all the time for my faults. I would like to kill myself. I cry all the time now. I'm quite annoyed or irritated a good deal of the time. So you can see here that we've got, it's a 21 item inventory, and at the end of this inventory you can score yourself. This I got from the internet, and this has been used in psychological research since 1965, the Beck Depression Inventory. And then this last inventory that I want to show you is this male specific inventory. And as I said before, one of the things that the Beck Depression Inventory didn't do was focus on some of the things that are more apparent in men who are depressed. So things like failure, or I need things to help me feel better, like alcohol, things like irritability, lots of work and lots of effort, but none of it really matters, right? I don't enjoy life. So some of these things seem like they are very similar to the other one, but more often they are focusing on what we call external behaviors. And when we focus on external behaviors, then what we end up seeing is that both men and women are scoring equally on measures of depression. So what we said earlier just doesn't seem to be true, that women are more likely to be depressed than men are, right? And that stats focus often on women. What we're finding is that men are just as depressed as women are. They just demonstrate their depression in different ways. And what we have to do as psychologists is we have to figure out how to measure that in appropriate ways. When we take a look at some of these other symptoms, such as we see their grief and feelings of guilt, we can see then that there's a great environmental component there, right? Grief is caused by the loss of something significant, and guilt is also caused by behaviors. So we see that these symptoms have an environmental component. When we feel grief or guilt, what we do is, and we are depressed, what we do is we engage in obsessive behaviors. Some of that can be ruminating behaviors as well. Anhedonia, we see an absence of dopamine. With grief and guilt, we see an absence of serotonin. Self-injury, another symptom of individuals who are depressed. What this is often a deflection and reattention of their pain elsewhere. That's the reason why individuals engage in self-injury. This psychomotor retardation, which we talked about before. Psychomotor retardation is a dysfunction in your bodily functions, one of them being zero energy. When individuals get a little bit of energy and feel better when they go to therapy, what we find is that very depressed individuals end up getting the energy to commit suicide. And what this is an absence of norepinephrine. This lack of energy is a lack of adrenaline. And then we have vegetative symptoms. Vegetative symptoms are involved in sleep, where individuals wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, for example, and can't get back to sleep. This is where they have appetite decreases. This is where they have increased physiological arousal in their body, and this increases anxiety. This is where individuals have a stress response 24/7, and it has to do with their biology. And what this does is create patterns, and this also then can clue people in on things like seasonal affective disorder. However, those things are less likely to be the cause of our depression than some of the other things like events in our lives. Okay. How do we handle stressful events? So here we've got 3 different stages that we go through when we are experiencing a stressful event. And the very first stage is called the alarm stage. And in this alarm stage, we are kind of caught off guard. And what that means is that event takes a lot of resources because we aren't prepared and we don't have those resources on board. So that we end up being shocked in stage 1, and it's alarm stage where we're caught off guard. You can see here that this says response to stress. Our response to stress at first is low because we have no resources. But then in stage 2, we begin to build what's called resistance. And this is where our response to stress is much higher. Why? Because we have resources on board. When our bodies get stressed, what we end up doing is going into what is considered a fight or flight mode. And in that fight or flight mode, what our bodies do is they prepare us for movement. That's our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. Our brains think we got to get moving, and our bodies start moving. We feel that because we begin to sweat. We begin to have increased heart rate. We have increased blood pressure, right? So that takes our resources down immediately. But then what we end up doing is we store fat, is what we do. We store our sugars and we store proteins. And in storing these resources, that's what we have available in the resistance stage. Okay? Then we go into our last stage, which is the exhaustion stage. Stage 3 is the exhaustion stage, and this is where we end up losing much of our resources that we had built up. As you can see, we end up losing considerable resources, even to the point of death. This was called the general adaptation syndrome. And it was Hans Selye determined this process, which he called a general adaptation syndrome, because this is what all of our bodies go through, no matter what kind of stress we are experiencing. So, the loss of a spouse, we go through this kind of stress. Hitting our brakes behind somebody so we don't get in an accident, our bodies go through the same thing. But what we have going on here now with so much anxiety and depression is individuals who are staying chronically in that stage 2 resistance stage. And so what ends up happening then is that they have stress hormones that are constantly elevated. And when our stress hormones are constantly elevated, what this ends up doing is it ends up creating dysfunction in our immune system, as well as certain things like an inflammatory response, high levels of anxiety, and even autoimmune dysfunction and allergy dysfunction as well. And as we said, when we get in that last stage, the exhaustion stage, what this does is the body reaches its limit as far as protective immune factors. And so what we end up doing is we see there could be mixtures of too many antibodies, for example, causing allergies, and at the same time, too little cellular immunity causing susceptibility to infection. And so we end up with dysregulation in this last stage, and it causes exhaustion, which can also lead to premature death. Now, here what I'm showing you is the 3 systems that are involved that we're going to end up talking about. So when we go into our fight or flight mode, again, what we end up doing is turning on what's called our sympathetic nervous system, or getting our body ready for fight or flight. And what this does, this sympathetic nervous system, is it gets blood and oxygen to our muscles so that they can get moving, and it shuts down other areas like our digestive system. Then what ends up happening is our hormonal system kicks in. So we've got our central nervous system, and our hormonal system kicks in, and the hormones are released in the blood. Now remember earlier when I was talking about key here is balancing our systems. And so when we have an imbalance in our system, what ends up happening is our brain indicates that through the hypothalamus. This is when we end up getting higher blood pressure, higher heart rates, and we begin to sweat as well. That is our hypothalamus telling our pituitary gland, get your body, and in particular, your hormones ready. So the hypothalamus indicates an imbalance, which then signals the pituitary gland, which is our master gland, get the hormones going. And in particular, what it does is activates the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are located on top of our kidneys, and this is what regulates things like adrenaline, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, along with cortisol, our stress hormone. So hormones are affected as well. And so you can also see why we might have dysregulation in our bodies when we've got hormones that are being released because of stress. we have this excess of hormones that are released in the body, we can see why there would be dysregulation. And in this dysregulation, what ends up happening is the immune system releases what's called cytokines. And cytokines communicate and significantly impact both the nervous system and the hormonal system. And this is what then ends up dysregulating our immune system, where immediately when we feel stress, we end up with inflammation going to that body, and the dysregulation can end up causing long-term inflammation. And what we know that is that inflammation is at the root cause of every single disease that we have. So we need to get our reactions to events under control so that we don't end up experiencing these chronic stages of inflammation and chronic stress. Okay, so that is all that I have for you today, and I always said that I have today's question. So today's question that I have has something to do with some of the studies that we've been looking at, and I want individuals to become just a little bit more aware of what is going on with their health and with their health care, and in particular, like I said, critically thinking about some of the science that's behind your health care decisions. And so today's question is focusing on one of the videos that I've talked about and presented to some of my students, but also want to expose my viewers to. And what this video is about is some of the ethical violations that scientists have been doing when they conducted their twin studies. And so these studies have been obviously extremely important in understanding what our genetic and environmental contributions are to our behavior. But one of the problems is that in some of those twin studies, what they did was they separated those twins unknowingly from their other twin in the name of science. And neither adopted parents nor the children who had a twin were told that they were part of this research study. And so my question for today is, do you think that scientists should be allowed to perform some of these experiments without individuals being able to give informed consent in order to find out some of the important medical and health conclusions that we've come up with? There you can see one of the videos that's out there on YouTube on this separating twins at birth, and you can take a look at some of these studies. I report this information about twin studies on a regular basis, and only recently found out that some of the data that was collected in these twin studies was collected unethically. So for today's question, I want to know, where do you think that science should continue to go as far as collecting data and collecting information? One of the things that's going on here with the pandemic is that we have companies such as Quest and Helix that's collecting private healthcare information from individuals, and they're collecting this information on a regular basis, and they are for-profit companies. So places like Walmart and CVS and Walgreens are hiring for-profit companies in order to do testing. And I would like to know, today's question is, what are these individuals doing with the data? And is this ethical to collect this kind of data from individuals unbeknownst to them, especially this new health data that we've seen that are going for-profit companies? Okay, so my name is Dr. Annette Feravich, and I am with Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit. And remember that you can ask questions by emailing me at Dr. Feravich, Dr. F as in Frank, ERA, V as in Victor, ICH. And you can also visit my website at www.healthymindbodyspirit.net. So thank you for joining me. This is Dr. Annette Feravich, and keep your mind, keep your body, and keep your spirit healthy.